Hey everybody, I'm Natalia Bonner. Welcome back. Okay, so I just finished up my brand new free class, the launch period of the 9-patch long 5.0. If you've not yet enrolled, run to our website, peaceandquilt.com. It's a fun free class where I teach you how to machine quilt with my Sway machine quilting rulers on a 9-patch quilt. So it's a great place to have a little bit of fun. But for quite some time now, I've really been wanting to try to attach my binding while on my Longarm. And I'm like, this is my quilt. This is a perfect opportunity to play around and try to attach my own binding. So I did pick up this tool. See if you can see that. It's called Brilliant Bindings for Longarm Quilters, and we do sell this on our website, peaceandquilt.com, but I've never tried it. So this is gonna be like what it's really like to learn how to attach your own binding. So I am going to be using the same material that I have here on the back of my 9-patch long quilt. I'm going to start out by cutting some 2.5-inch strips together, and then I will press those and sew those together on my domestic machine before I come over to the Longarm to attach it. So let's see what happens. For my binding, I'm going to be using 2.5-inch strips. So I'll start out by squaring up the end of my fabric. Once I have that squared up, then I'm going to use the ruler for my guide. I'll line up the 2.5-inch marked line on the ruler with the edge of my fabric right there. Use my rotary cutter and cut my first strip. Then I'll just repeat that process. Before I started my binding, I did figure out exactly how many strips I need for the size of quilt that I'm binding. So next I'll get my binding strips and I'm going to sew them together. Probably should get a little bit organized here. But I'll line them up right sides together. And then when I line mine up, I just like to eyeball about 1/4 inch. So I'll line them up and I'm just looking. But one way to do it is when you put your foot down, if you have your 1/4 inch set on here, then your needle should start right in the middle of the V that is created by the 2 mitered pieces. And I'll sew right across that bias edge. And then again, if it's set at 1/4 inch, my stitching should come out right on that V that is created. So then I'll grab my next strip and place, again, the same thing, lining up about 1/4 inch. And you could mark this if you wanted to. I feel like I have a pretty good eye for judging 1/4 inch. And then I'll sew my next one. I'm sure there's a million other ways to do this, but this is what I'm trying today. So next I'm going to press all of my seams for this binding open. I like to open them with my fingers and then just press right along that binding. And I like to use just a wool mat for my pressing. So now that I have all of my seams pressed open on my binding, I start out by folding the end of the binding in half, and then I'll press that, just the beginning of it, on my wool mat in half. And I'll just kind of hold on to it. Okay, so once I have that done, now I'm going to add this Binding Ease by Quilted Hearts. And it's a really cool, it's a silicone tool. You can order it from Quilted Hearts on their website. But so I'll start feed it through here, then I'll continue to feed it through the other side. Now on the back of my iron, so it's the one with the stand and the lift on it, I'll simply turn that off. And now I'll place my iron on the silicone mat and I'll fold this side over here and just start to pull my binding through that silicone pad, and it will press itself as I'm pulling it through. Now you're probably going to say, well, can't the iron get too hot on there? So the cool thing about my version, and I don't know if they're all the same, but my version of this iron is if it does start to get too hot, it will automatically lift back up. And there you have it. So I'll give it a minute to rest and then I'll continue on pulling that binding through. Okay, so this step could be unnecessary, but I am doing my binding here on the 9 patch long 5.0 class sample, and this is actually a panel that I purchased from Honest Fabric. And because it's the panel, it does have like this finished edge around the outside of it, so I do want to cut that off before I actually do the binding, or I don't want to include that in my binding. So what I've decided I'm going to do is actually make this border all the way around the outside of my quilt a little bit smaller. So I've got my large ruler here and I'm going to lay it on my quilt and I'm going to use the Mark Be Gone marker, and I'm going to be marking where the edge of my quilt is going to be. So let's hop down here and do that. So just the way the panel is created, I feel like 3-inch border is going to be the perfect size for me. So I'm starting out with this large square rotary ruler and I'm lining it up, making sure that 45-degree angle is lined up. Everything is as straight as I can get it. And then I'm going to use this Mark Be Gone marker. I'm marking kind of a heavy line to indicate that outside edge. Okay, so next up I'm going to change my thread color to a color that matches a little bit better. This is going to be So Fine color number 507. I've already changed my bobbin to just a neutral pre-wound super bob, pretty much what I'm always using. When I change my top thread though, I always like to change from the front of the machine. So to do so, I'll grab that top thread, cut it, but leave a pretty long tail, pull off that previous thread. Now I'll grab a long tail from the new thread, place my thread down on the thread stand or the cone stand, and then I'll tie the two pieces together in like a double or a square, I don't even know, in a couple of knots. Actually did learn how to tie knots at one point in life and knew their names, but anyways, so a couple of knots there, and then I'll simply pull my thread all the way through. I don't pull it all the way down to the needle, but I'll pull it all the way through. This way, I don't ever have to rethread my machine unless, you know, I start dealing with a lot of thread breakages or something like that. Okay, so next up, I think that I'm ready to attach my binding. I think I have all the prep work done, but the first thing I'm going to do is find the center of this big piece of binding. I want it to end about the top of the quilt. Because I'm just down here at the bottom of the quilt, all I marked was what was down here in my throat space, so this edge. And I'm going to start here and I'm going to be working like backwards up through the quilt. I feel like because it's all quilted, everything's all stabilized, I don't think it should necessarily matter if I start up there at the top or down at the bottom, but this is my first time attempting this, so could be wrong. Okay, so I found that halfway point. I'm just going to stick a pin in that so that I know where that halfway point is. I guess you could mark it with a Mark Be Gone marker too if you wanted. But once I have that marked, now I'm going to come over here to the quilt. Let's move all of my scissors, and I'm going to line this up right along that marked line. Okay, so I can see that this is where my center is, and I know these markings are hard to see on camera because it's dark on dark, but that's about the center right there. So I am actually going to just place a pin right in there to kind of hold it in place. And now I'm going to repeat that, just placing a few pins along that line just to make sure it stays nice and stable. Okay, because I want to create a nice mitered corner, I'm also going to use this ruler. This is the Brilliant Bindings ruler that I'm trying for the first time, but I'm going to line that up. If this were the edge of the quilt right there, I would line this edge up right with the edge of the quilt. But because I'm using the lines that I've marked, I'm going to line that up right with where the edge of my quilt is going to be, and I'm going to mark 1/4 of an inch away from the corner. So the corner's over here. And I'm marking this 1/4 of an inch marking. So when I'm attaching this binding here, I'll stitch right to this point, and then I'm going to stitch off the fabric, and then that's where I'll create my miter, and we'll get there in a minute. I'm going to be attaching my binding here on my Gammill 22-inch machine. So from my needle position to the outside of my foot is 1/4 of an inch. That's awesome. I know that that's the spacing I want to use. So now because I have this ruler, I'm going to use the ruler to attach my binding. So I'll engage my machine and I'm going to line the side of the ruler up right against the side of this binding. It's also the line that's the edge of my quilt. So if this was like a normal quilt and the normal outside where I would usually be binding it, I would be lining everything up along with that outside edge of the quilt. So I felt like it would be best to start kind of in the center of the quilt, and I'm going to work here across the quilt from that center point over to the right side. And again, I'm going to be stopping my stitching once I get to the line that I had marked that's 1/4 of an inch away from the edge. So one thing that I definitely found out or realized as I was attaching this binding was it was better to really slow down and just really work along that binding. Now you can see here that I'm holding my ruler like I do when I'm ruler quilting closer to my body and just gliding along that edge. But as I was doing this, I actually found that it was more like I felt like I could stabilize everything a little bit better if I was actually holding the ruler on top of the binding. So when I reached my first corner, then I stitched to that line that I had marked. When I reached that line that I had marked, then I stitched right off the edge. So not to the end, but like right off of the marking. Then at that point, I created the miter by folding my fabric into the miter. Now I'm going to start in the corner, so I'm off of the quilt, but I'm going to stitch right onto that miter, and I'll stitch right up along the side of that quilt. So now I'm attaching the binding to the side. One thing I will definitely say is that when I was working on the bulk in the mitered corners, there was a lot of bulk there. So I found it was almost easier if I held that fabric down and then just took like single stitches to make sure that it just moved, you know, perfectly in place. I didn't want it to get kind of crazy there. If you have tips, feel free to share them. So as I continue to go, then I'll take out the pins and add the pins. And here you can see, this is where I started using the ruler and holding it on top of my binding. And I'm lining up the markings on the ruler on top of the binding. And I really felt like, but as soon as I started doing this, I just had a lot better control of how the binding was being attached. Okay, so here's another look of that, and you can see how I'm going to be holding my ruler and stitching along the edge until I get to that marked line. So the marked line is 1/4 of an inch away from the corner. I'll stop at that point, and now I'm going to stitch right off the edge of that binding. So here you can see how I'll fold and finger press my fabric to create that nice miter. And when I started going to my second corner, I actually found that it was really beneficial just to place a pin there to help everything stay nice and stable. So after I worked over to that right side, then obviously I went across the left side of the quilt, quilted what fit in, well, not quilted, I always am just quilting, but attached the binding what would fit in my throat space. Then I advanced the quilt backwards up the quilt, and now I'm going to continue attaching that binding with what currently fits in my throat space. So first I'll do the right side and then the left side. And once I finish the left side, I'll actually stop and leave my needle in the down position and then advance my quilt. And then at that point, I'll just continue on with the stitching on the left side and then go to the right side. And I'll repeat that process. Doesn't necessarily save a ton of time, but it's just something that I sometimes feel like saves a little bit. So I'll repeat that same process until I get all the way up to the top of the quilt. Now I'm sure that there are ways, actually this tool that I'm using, in the instructions that come with it, there are directions of how to sew those two final pieces of your binding together at the end. I am choosing, because I'm going to just be attaching my binding to the backside by machine, I'm just going to finish attaching the binding or sewing the binding strips together on my domestic machine. I know how to do it that way, so I'm just going to do it that way. So then once I have all that binding attached, now I'm taking my quilt off the long arm. This cool tool does have a little measuring space at the end of it that you can use, and that will help you mark the 1/2 inch line so that you can easily sew your binding strips together and have the right measurement. It's pretty cool. So you can totally use a rotary cutter now and go through and trim along the edge of the binding. I'm just going to use scissors. And I'll trim right next to the edge of that binding. You know, if you want a fuller binding, you could trim wider. So I've come back over to my domestic machine now, and I'm using a 1/4 inch seam allowance and sewing the two pieces that I use this little tool over on the long arm to create. And hopefully it's just gonna work out exactly like it should. I'll go press that open. So at my domestic machine now, I will stitch the rest of that binding to the quilt top. Okay, so now I'm attaching it to the back of the quilt here on my domestic machine, just pulling it over. Sometimes I'll use like Wonder clips or something like that to kind of hold it, but this one I'm just kind of holding it down as I go, and so far it's looking pretty good considering it's my first one. Okay, so I've just finished attaching that binding by machine. I'm going to go wash my quilt because I love that like fresh crinkly look after the wash is all complete. So I'll wash and dry it, but I actually think it turned out pretty cool. Would I do it again? Yes, but I think I would probably, if I do the binding by machine again, I would probably attach it as I'm going. I feel like doing it the way that I did today actually was pretty time consuming going back through, but if I was doing it as I was going, it would be pretty simple. So definitely we'll try it again in the future. I hope you all found a bit of inspiration. Don't forget to share your projects and quilting inspired by my machine quilting in our Peace and Quilt Show and Tell Facebook group. I'll be back soon with another fun video. Make sure you do check out the Peace and Quilt Academy over on our website, peaceandquilt.com, where I'm sharing 2 new videos every single month of me custom machine quilting quilts from start to finish. Also, make sure you hit that subscribe button. See you later.